Exposure kills slowly, panic kills fast. History makes this distinction clear in a way modern survival culture often ignores. Cold, heat, hunger, and thirst are dangerous, but they usually give time to adapt, to make decisions, to correct mistakes. Panic collapses that time window. It hijacks judgment, burns energy, and turns manageable problems into fatal ones. When survival stories are examined closely, exposure is rarely the first cause of death. Panic is the trigger that sets everything else in motion. Panic destroys decision-making before the body fails. The human body is remarkably resilient. People have survived days in freezing conditions, weeks with minimal food, and long stretches of heat and dehydration. What they couldn't survive was a breakdown in decision-making. Panic narrows perception, vision tunnels, hearing fades, time distorts. In this state, people stop solving problems and start reacting. History shows that once reaction replaces reasoning, survival odds plummet. Mountaineers abandoned shelter because they felt trapped. Sailors jumped into cold water to escape sinking ships they could have stayed aboard longer. Soldiers ran from cover during bombardments, exposing themselves to fire that had not yet reached them. The environment didn't kill them. Panic told them to move when staying still was safer. Panic wastes energy when energy is life. Exposure is an energy problem. Cold, heat, and hunger all demand careful management of calories, hydration, and movement. Panic does the opposite. It accelerates movement, increases heart rate, and burns reserves at the worst possible time. Historical accounts from cold weather warfare show that panicked troops marched too fast, sweating through insulation and soaking their clothing. Once activity stopped, hypothermia set in rapidly. Calm units moved slowly, stayed dry, and survived longer in the same conditions. In deserts, panicked travelers overexerted themselves in heat, chasing distant landmarks or water sources that weren't there. Calm individuals rested, conserved moisture, and waited for conditions to improve. Exposure punishes inefficiency. Panic guarantees it. Panic breaks patterns that keep people alive. Survival, really depends on rhythm, rest, movement, observation, and maintenance repeat in predictable cycles. But panic shatters these patterns. People forget to drink even when water is available. They stop eating because appetite disappears. They neglect shelter maintenance. They abandon navigation discipline. History shows that survivors were not the strongest or best equipped, but the ones who kept routines under stress. Polar expeditions that succeeded followed rigid, boring schedules even in crisis. Those that failed often did so after routines collapsed under pressure. Once structure disappeared, panic filled the gap. Panic, turns uncertainty into imagined catastrophe. One of panic's most dangerous traits is that it invents threats. The mind tends to fill gaps with worst-case scenarios and, treats them as immediate reality. Lost travelers, for instance, assumed they were being followed. Isolated soldiers believed they were surrounded. Sometimes people see faint lights and assume rescue is imminent, prompting a reckless movement. In reality, many of these situations were actually survivable if assessed calmly. Panic created urgency where, really, patience was required. History shows that survivors waited, they verified, and, importantly, they resisted the urge to act on fear alone. In group survival situations, panic is, contagious. One person's fear amplifies another's. This effect has actually been documented in evacuations, shipwrecks, battlefield retreats, and disaster zones. Once panic spreads, coordination collapses, people move in conflicting directions, and resources are hoarded or even abandoned. Leaders lose authority, and at that point exposure becomes, inevitable. Groups that survived maintained discipline even when frightened. They slowed decisions, centralized control, and limited movement. Panic was treated as a threat equal to the environment itself. Exposure is visible. A frozen body or a dehydrated corpse offers a clear explanation. Panic leaves no physical trace. It's just easier to say someone froze than to say they ran themselves into exhaustion after making a series of bad decisions driven by fear. But, when accounts are read carefully, panic appears again and again just before death. The storm hadn't worsened yet. The cold hadn't peaked. Supplies weren't fully depleted. What changed was behavior. Training mattered because it controlled panic. Military survival training historically focused less on comfort and more on emotional control. Drills were designed to slow reactions, enforce procedures, and create familiarity with stress. The goal wasn't bravery, it was preventing panic from taking over. Soldiers were taught to stop, assess, and act deliberately even when conditions were, really deteriorating. Civilian survival advice often skips this entirely, focusing on gear and techniques while ignoring the mental discipline that actually keeps those tools usable. The survival advantage of calm. Calm does not mean confidence. It means delaying action until it's justified. It means accepting discomfort without trying to escape it immediately. And, it means preserving options instead of chasing certainty. People who survived exposure events didn't feel less fear. They managed it. They recognized panic as a separate threat and, actively resisted it. They slowed down, they sat still, they repeated simple tasks, and they focused on what could be controlled. The lesson history makes unavoidable. Exposure tests the body. Panic destroys the mind that guides it. Most survival situations are lost not because conditions became impossible, but because panic made people act as if they already were. Control panic and exposure becomes manageable. Fail to control it, and even mild conditions can turn fatal. This is the quiet truth history keeps revealing. Staying alive is often less about fighting the environment and more about refusing to let fear make decisions for you.